Just to let you guys know, Leading Age will be having a couple people attend CPI training, and this is being done through the DHS grant. And what we will be doing is, after we've received that training, we'll be going out there and offering it to all the different facilities in the state of Iowa, whether Leading Age or otherwise. So that CPI training will be coming to the state for our facilities in the future. Our next speaker is Cheryl Nolan. She began her career as a dispatcher jailer at the Hardin County Sheriff's Office in 1979. Cheryl served as a communications specialist, in other words, a dispatcher, for the Department of Public Safety in 1981 and joined the Iowa Sex Offender Registry Office in November of 2003 and is currently serving as a program planner. She created specifications and design for the Iowa Sex Offender Registry database that is used by the criminal justice community to collect information and track sex offenders in Iowa. She was also involved in creating the curriculum that is in use today for instructing new officers about the Iowa Sex Offender Registry. She was also involved in the curriculum for training for the CASA volunteers, which is the Coalition Against Sexual Assault. She'll be joining us this morning, and she'll be reviewing sexual offender laws and potential impact on our policies. And she's also going to be visiting with us about safety and notification policies to consider. So please welcome Cheryl.
Okay, can everybody hear me okay? Boy, that was quite the intro. I never knew I was quite that important. I'm celebrating 32 years with the Department of Public Safety, and that's pretty exciting. But I want to talk about the Sex Offender Registry this morning. And what I want to talk about is, let's start with, how did we come about getting a registry? And it started because of various events that we had that occurred. Jacob Wetterling, you may have heard of him. He was 11 years old. He was abducted in Minnesota. His brother and a friend had ridden their bicycles to a convenience store, and they were returning. They were approached by a man. The man asked the man asked all the boys how old they were, and he took Jacob, and Jacob has never been found. Jacob's parents did not know that down the street from where they lived was a halfway house for sex offenders. So through that tragedy, they appealed to the Congress to obtain a sex offender registry. Now, in the beginning, the registry was only available to law enforcement. It was not available to the public. Megan Kanka was 7 years old. Let's see if I can advance. There we go. Megan Kanka was 7 years old. She was, there was a registered sex offender living across the street from where Megan lived. And her mother did not know that the man across the street was a registered sex offender because it was only available to law enforcement. That man enticed Megan, "Do you want to come over to my house, play with my new puppy?" And she was sexually assaulted and murdered. And through that particular case is how sex offender registry information became available to the public. The next case we have is from Drew Sodine from Minnesota. She was a college student in North Dakota, and she was traveling back and forth from her home, and she was murdered by a sex offender that was in North Dakota, but from the state of Minnesota. And so through that tragedy, we obtained the National Sex Offender Registry website, the NSORG OPW. The state of Iowa was the second state to join this national website. There is no one place that we can go to get 100% of all the information available on sex offenders. Each state does it a little bit differently. Like I said, Iowa was like the second or third state to jump on board with the National Sex Offender Registry. It really is a place where you can go and access the websites of all the other states that are participating, but not quite 100% of the states are participating at this time. So I do want you to know that when you're doing your research to see if someone is registered or has been registered, that there's not going to be one-stop shopping. There's not one only place that you can go to obtain this information. Then there was Adam Walsh, and I'm sure that you've heard of Adam Walsh. His father does what's the name of that show? America's Most Wanted. And he has been very active in missing persons cases and through getting convictions on sex offenders and finding some of these criminals. His son was abducted from a Sears department store in the toys section, and that was in Florida, and he was found murdered and decapitated. His case went unsolved until recently. In 2008, they finally determined that this Otis O'Toole was the one who had killed Adam, and he confessed on his deathbed in 1996. He was a suspect from the beginning, but he had recanted several times, and then he would confess again, and then he recanted again. So from that incident, we got the Adam Walsh Act. And the Adam Walsh Act had replaced the Jacob Wetterling Act and Megan's Law. And what it's designed to do is to make all states the same in regard to sex offender registration, in that we all have the same rules and regulations. Iowa currently is not considered an Adam Walsh Act state. Our rules and regulations regarding sex offenders are stricter on the state level than they are on the national level. So that's one of the reasons why we are not yet compliant. It's also made for many other federal charges that are now available, both sex offenses and failure to comply, that are now charged on the federal level, in addition to any charges that could be handled on the state level. I wanted to take a look at some of the Iowa cases, things that have happened closer to home. We never expect these tragedies to happen in our town, in our neighborhood. It's something that happens somewhere else. It happens in Florida. It happens in New York City. It happens in Los Angeles. It doesn't happen in Iowa. But unfortunately, it does happen here, and anything that can happen in those bigger communities can also happen here in the state of Iowa. Jetsetta Gage was 10 years old. Jetsetta was kidnapped in Cedar Rapids by Roger Paul Bentley. Roger Paul Bentley's brother was currently in jail for sexually molesting Jetsetta Gage. Roger Paul contacted Jetsetta's mother and said, "We feel really bad about what my brother did to your daughter. Is there anything I can do for you?" And mom is like, "Well, you're a mechanic, aren't you?" And he said, "Yes. And I need some work done on my van. Can you come over and change the oil in my van?" And he agreed to perform that task for her. And during that period of time when he was at her home, she was away from home. She was attending classes, and then he took Jetsetta Gage and took her to a rural location in Johnson County, where she was found murdered and sexually assaulted. On that particular case, the type of legislation that was introduced or talked about was extending sentences for sex offenders. And in 2013, I think everybody's pretty much familiar with the case on Kathleen Shepard, age 15, and Desi Hughes, age 12. They just got off the school bus in Dayton. And Desi was able to escape and provide information on the offender, who was identified as Michael Klunder, a registered sex offender from a nearby county. A little bit more about Michael Klunder is that he was a model registrant as far as the sex offender registry goes. He did all of his in-person verifications. He changed his jobs in a timely manner. He updated what vehicles he was driving. He was always on time with all of the information and in compliance with what he had to do as far as his regulations go. He was registered for a 1991 offense for kidnapping. He had kidnapped a 21-year-old female, and before that, he had kidnapped 2 3-year-old children and left them in a dumpster in December. And the children were found and then ultimately were saved. And in that particular case, I'm trying to remember now. I should have made better notes on what he did. But on that particular case was prior to the sex offender registry, I believe. And the case did not involve a sexual motivation, and so he was not required to register for that particular offense. So he was sentenced for a total of 41 years in prison, and he was released after 22 years. And I think that one of the things that's coming out of this particular incident, that Caitlin Shepard's family is petitioning, or at least talking about getting longer sentences, in that, like, he was sentenced to 41 years but got out in 22. So those will be some of the things that are probably yet to come. The search for Kathleen continues today. I was hoping when I was writing this PowerPoint program that she would be found by the time I came to speak today, but unfortunately that's not the case. The investigation is continuing against Michael Klunder, and there is a possibility that he was involved in the missing cousins from Evansdale, Iowa, the Morrissey and Cook cousins that were abducted and found murdered in July of 2012. So that's still an ongoing investigation. And it's through these events is how we get laws and regulations and rules. The Iowa Sex Offender Registry, our website address is www.iowasexoffenders.com. That is where you can go to look to see if someone is a registered sex offender. It is a public website. It is free. So we urge you to use that in your requirement to search the registry. And who appears on the registry? Well, a person has to be convicted of specific offenses. So there are some offenses that require sexual motivation. Some offenses like indecent exposure, sexual abuse first degree, second degree, and third degree, those require registration. We go by what the person was convicted of, the actual statute that they were convicted of, in order to make these determinations on if they have to register. They also could be convicted for a specified federal offense, and that could be a military offense, a tribal offense, or a federal offense from the U.S. Marshals. One thing I wanted to remind you is I'm sure that you've had people say, I know somebody who's on that list and all he was doing was urinating in public. Urination in public does not require registration on the sex offender registry. And so when people tell me that story, I tell them, I'm really sorry you believe that. I'm really sorry you believe that, because urination in public does not require registration. There we go. Now, who is not on our website? Remember I said that 100%, there's no one place to go to get 100% of everybody? These people are not on our website. If the person was under the age of 20 and they were convicted specifically of 709.42C4, that's a long statute, but I have learned exactly what each part of it means. 709.4 is sex abuse in the third degree. The 2 means that they are not cohabitating as husband and wife. The C means that the victim is 14 or 15. And the 4 means that the offender was 4 or more years older. This can often be referred to as Romeo and Juliet. The important thing I'm talking about here, though, is for a person under the age of 20. They still have to register. They're still required to follow the rules and regulations, but they do not appear on the website. Well, if we have an offender who is age 50, who has a sexual relationship with a 14-year-old, have they met 709.42C4? Not cohabitating as husband and wife, victim was 14, and if you're 50, you're 4 or more years older. The 50-year-old is still going to appear on our public website. So this is really truly from our public website. It's the Romeo and Juliet that are not on the public website. You will not find people on our public website that are no longer living, working, or attending school in Iowa. Now, some of these people are still required to register. Should they ever return to the state of Iowa, they'll have to register. But if they move across to Nebraska and we've confirmed that they've registered there, then we remove them from our public website. We also have people that have expired from our registry. So the amount of registration is someone who has completed their 10-year registration. How long is registration? This question came up earlier. It's a minimum of 10 years. And the Iowa registry began in July 1 of 1995. So we've removed approximately 3,675 people have completed their sex offender registration. Now, the question would come in, if someone had an offense and now they're coming into your institution, they're no longer on the Iowa Sex Offender Registry, where else can you obtain that information? Does anybody know? You could obtain it from possibly Iowa Courts Online. How many people are familiar with SING? Several hands, single point of inquiry, and hit may come up in a SING request along those lines. So our first one started coming off in July 1 of 2005. It gets to be quite complicated. I have a 2-page checklist I'd go through in order to determine that someone has completed their 10 years. For 10-year registration, we mean 10 years. So if they've spent a day in jail, they get another day on the registry. If they've gone to prison for 2 years for theft, they're on the registry for an additional 2 years. So these are the different types of things we're looking for. Also, if someone has had a second or subsequent offense, they are required to register for life. This came about in 1998. When the registry first began in 95, all registration was for 10 years. In 98, they said, well, wait a minute, what about these people who have multiple offenses? And so they were required to register for life. Then in 1999, they said, well, what if we have people convicted of these specific bad offenses, if you will, although I don't really like the term good, bad, they're just the offense that's listed. An aggravated offense, one conviction of an aggravated offense equals lifetime registration. Now, one of the misnomers is that aggravated offense is not the same thing as an aggravated misdemeanor. It's not the same thing as an aggravated felony, if there is such a thing. There's a specific list of individual charges with subsections that include this lifetime registration. Some examples are sex abuse in the first degree, sex abuse in the second degree. That's the one that usually includes a weapon involved or a child underneath the age of 12. Sex abuse in the third degree, subsection 1 only. And what that is when there is force involved in the sexual assault. And there's a few more. I'm not going to go through all of them. Murder, criminal transmission of HIV, those types of things are also aggravated offenses and require lifetime registration. What are the restrictions for sex offenders? There's 3 or 4 basic restrictions. They're tier level, exclusionary zones, residency restriction, and prohibited employment. The tier. All the tier level determines is how frequently an offender has to appear in person at the sheriff's office to verify their relevant information. There's about 21 items that equal relevant information, such as your name, date of birth, what kind of car you drive, who is living with you, email addresses, where do you work, and there's, like I said, over 21 issues that are relevant information. The tier is determined by what offense the person was convicted of. And in some cases, the age of the victim makes a difference, and in some cases, the age of the offender makes a difference. If somebody was convicted of sex abuse in the first degree, and they were under the age of 14, and were adjudicated delinquent for that, they are a tier 1. But if someone who is greater than age 14, such as our 50-year-old person, is convicted of sex abuse in the first degree, they are a tier 3. Tier 1 means you have to appear once per year, tier 2 is twice per year, and tier 3 is 4 times per year. Now, depending on what offenders you get at your institutions or facilities, rather, is what I meant to say, that I know that some sheriff's offices will come to the facility in order to meet this tier requirement. It is up to the individual sheriff's office as opposed to you having to take the person into the sheriff's office. All offenders are required to have their photograph updated once a year. So the tier 1s, that's every time they go in, they have to get their photo taken. Are there any questions about the tier levels so far? Okay. The exclusionary zones. Exclusionary zones apply to all sex offenders that have a minor victim. So if their victim was 17 years old, they are subject to the exclusionary zones. And although it's more detailed in the law, the bottom line of it is they must have written permission to be on the real property of a school, a child care facility, or a public library. They have to have written permission to be on those locations. They cannot work at any of those locations, and they are prohibited from loitering within 300 feet of any of those locations. Now, some sex offenders may live across the street from the library, or they may live across the street from the school, and they can live there, but they cannot loiter. So when I'm teaching my law enforcement classes, I say if the offender is sitting out in the front porch and when the kids are coming to school in the morning or leaving in the afternoon, if they're sitting out there on the porch watching all the kids and saying, hey, little girl, do you want some candy? That's probably could be a chance to be loitering. And we do have a definition of that you're trying to obtain another victim. The residency restriction. This is AKA the 2,000-foot law. And in order to make this one make a little bit more sense, I went to the old law. In the beginning, when we first got the 2,000-foot law, it was signed into law in July of 2002. It immediately went into appeal, and there was no enforcement until September of 2005. That's when it came out of appeal, and it was determined that this law was constitutional and we could have this law. So in the beginning, it applied to all sex offenders who had a minor victim. Well, what we came across was sex offenders would register that they were living at the rest area. And how that worked is residence was defined as where you sleep. So they would, in my rose-colored glasses world, they lived at home with their wife and children. At 9 o'clock at night, they would put the kids to bed, kiss their wife, drive off to the rest area, sleep at the rest area, get up at 6 in the morning, go home and shower and get ready for work and go to work, and they were considered compliant. So the 2,000-foot law has a lot of intricacies involved with it. We have expanded the definition of residence in 2009. Some of the concessions that they made is instead of it applying to everyone that has a minor victim, these specific offenses were selected. Sex abuse in the first degree, sex abuse in the second degree, and sex abuse in the third degree, except for our 709.42C4, which we talked about was the Romeo and Juliet 4 or more years older. They are not subject to the 2,000-foot law. Are there any questions over who has to abide by 2,000-foot? Okay. Then the next restriction that sex offenders have is prohibited employment. And this is the part that affects you the most, is that they shall not be an employee of a facility providing services for dependent adults. And then it's by the definition, and I would assume more of you in this room are familiar with that definition than when I am. When it comes up, I have to look it up. Or at events where dependent adults participate in programming. And when I'm teaching on that particular item, I say, okay, like if the nursing home has bingo on Wednesday night, a sex offender is not allowed to be at the bingo that's held at the facility because it's a programming where dependent adults are participating, or we're assuming people are participating from the facility. They cannot loiter on the premises or grounds or at an event. And so, like if there's a Special Olympics event, sex offenders are not allowed to go there and park cars or direct traffic at the Special Olympics event. Are there any questions over that portion? The question is, if the resident is in the facility, does it still apply that they cannot attend bingo? There are exemptions for people that, which is pretty much what we're coming to next, is the exemptions. An adult sex offender who is a patient or resident is exempt from this particular section. So if they're in a medical assistance program, a home and community-based waiver program, they are exempt, and especially if it's one for their particular habilitation process.
I have a question
Yes.
regarding the dependent adults. And actually, this is a question. I'm Bill Nutty with Leading Age Iowa. We are helping to host this event. One of our members called. It's a CCRC, Continuing Care Retirement Community. So they have the nursing facility, the assisted living, and independent living for adults. The administrator said he found out that the bus driver was on the registry, but he was only driving the independent living adults around to community functions. Would that apply then, the dependent adult provisions?
The question is, if we have a sex offender that's the bus driver for a multi-facility and they're only driving the regular adults and not the dependent adults, can they still do that?
Yes.
That would be up to the county attorney and an officer to investigate and decide that. You know, it doesn't come straight out and say yes or no. That's kind of a gray area. It could be considered working for the facility and therefore would not be allowed. You know, there's always a lot of what ifs, and unfortunately, I really can't answer those questions because it would depend on the actual situation, and then ultimately the county attorney is the one who would prosecute a violation. So it would be up to the county attorney to decide.
Any other questions while I have the microphone?
Okay. Again, this is the final exemption that if the offender, they can participate in things if it's part of their individual plan. Notifications. The Department of Public Safety is required to keep a website, and that's our method of notifying the public. Sheriff's offices are required to notify the schools when an offender moves into or within the district. Sheriff's offices are also required to notify the boards of directors of all school districts, any sex offender under the age of 21, so that they can determine what is the best method of education for that individual. One of the other things, questions that I had was, how would someone get removed if they had an offense that was over 20 years old and they were in need of care? I should have put this back when I was talking about life and 10 years. If the person has lifetime registration and they are not on any type of supervision, I have nothing in the code to offer as far as coming off of the registry. What the code does offer is if the person goes back to court and gets the conviction reversed or otherwise set aside. Reversed or otherwise set aside. And when offenders call and ask me that question, I'm very clear that that's exactly the language that's in the code. So if they say something other than those two words, then I can't count it to remove them. Their conviction still stands. Now, what I don't know, because I'm a lot of things, but a lawyer is not one of them, is can you go back to court after 20 years and get your case reversed or otherwise set aside? I don't even know if that's legal. All I can say is that's what the Chapter 692A says. It does not count as a conviction, so therefore you would not be required to register. The other avenue for people to come off of the registry, if they are on supervision, they may seek a modification, and that is done in the district court where the person lives and in the county where they were convicted. So they have to go to both places to seek a modification. I always recommend that the offender obtain an attorney to help them with this process. There are numerous hoops that you have to go through, including getting a risk assessment and being assigned a low risk. It's my understanding that A lot of times they require that we do a determination to make sure they're required to register before we even begin this process. So there are some hoops to go through, but it can be done. Juvenile offenders have less hoops that they have to go through, but they can also seek a modification, and a judge can say, okay, you only have to register for 10 years, even though your conviction requires lifetime registration. Or they can say, you are not subject to the 2,000-foot law, even though your conviction says you're subject to the 2,000-foot law. So those types of modifications are available. Yes.
On the exempt part, how do they become exempt? I mean, what are the qualifications or the criteria, other than them being admitted to a nursing facility or home community-based services or?
They would have to meet the definition of a dependent adult
To be considered exempt?
for
And then-
like the exemptions from participating.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay. So if we have someone that's considered exempt, is that still someone that's reported and they live right next door to a school or that type of thing? Are they still reported by the sheriff's office to the schools?
Yes. They still have to, okay, like, if I understand correctly, we have an offender who's going to a nursing facility, and there's a school right next door to the nursing facility, and the offender is subject to the 2,000-foot law,
Yes.
okay? Then they can get an exemption. You do have to get, according to 692A, a judge has to grant an exemption to that. But you go to court. And again, I'm not an attorney, so I don't really know all of the steps involved with that, but you can get an exemption.
Okay, thank you.
We have another question?
I work at a CCRC as well, so we're a pretty large campus. We actually have a daycare on site. How does that work as far as who we're allowed to have admitted to our health center?
Well, the 692A requires a sex offender to have written permission from the administrator to be on the quote-unquote real property of the child care facility. So I guess that would have to be handled within campus on what you determine as this portion is the real property of the child care facility, okay? Then the person would not be allowed to loiter within 300 feet of the child care facility. Well, what is the definition of loitering? You know, I don't have the complete definition in front of me, but it's basically circling around that a reasonable person would believe that the purpose of your behavior is to obtain another victim. So whether or not on your campus you have a 300-foot restriction for the offenders that you have on your campus would be something that would be up to you.
You had mentioned once they're considered a dependent adult. Would that have anything to do with that?
No, the dependent adult would not grant an exemption to the exclusionary zones. Any other questions? Okay. Notifications. A criminal and juvenile justice agency may provide relevant information to the public. They can also notify organizations and employers. Occasionally I get calls, oh, you told my work that I was an offender. Well, we can do that. And actually that is handled by the local authorities on what type of notification they do. Like I said, the department puts people on the website, and then it's up to the local authorities. The sheriff's offices are required to make the 2 school notifications, but as far as like passing out flyers, I got a call the other day. I just found out my landlord is a sex offender. Was he required to tell me that? No, he's not, because the offenders are not required to make notifications. Law enforcement is required to do the notifications, and there are 2 that are required by law. The rest is up to the sheriff's offices. Some of them annually put an article in the paper about everybody in their county that's registered. Some agencies do it weekly. Some of them post it at the post office. It's up to the local agencies to decide how they do that distribution. The Iowa Sex Offender web page, I want to kind of get through this a little bit quickly about some of the features we have is Most Wanted, a registration watch, and that's the big one. I want to skip to that one. Notifications and watches. You can sign up to be notified when a sex offender moves within a mile of your own address. You can do it for your work address. You can do it for your grandkids or your kids' address. I have several set up for my own personal family. I'm also watching some high-profile sex offenders that I get a notification every time their record is changed. I get a notification on that. You can do it by city, county, or zip code. You can do it by individual, and you can choose to receive email notifications, voice messages, and text messages. The next thing we're coming into or working on at the Sex Offender Registry is facial recognition. That's our next project regarding the website. Let's see. This is an example. It's an old example from the website, but this is where I put in my hometown of Iowa Falls. Excuse me. They provide you a list of the offenders. Then you can click on whatever offender you want to click on, and then you will see the information on what crimes they committed. We can see that, like on this guy, a couple of them have the same date. So that was basically 2 counts of lascivious acts with a child, and then he has another count on another day. This guy has to register for life because he has 2 or more offenses. So there's that type of information you can get. You can print out these particular checks. If you're running people and doing queries on the website and it's a negative response, you should be able to print out the page that shows that you queried this person on this date and time to put in your file to show that you did a search of the Iowa Sex Offender Registry. Are there any questions on how to do those searches? Have you heard of the searches before? Okay. Yes.
Any kind of statistics? Oh, I'm so used to talking. Do you have any kind of stats saying how many people they don't even know where they are? They were on the registry, you can't find them?
Oh, our most wanted, we generally have 10 or 15 people a month on that. And to make it to the most wanted, there has to be an active warrant for your arrest. As far as whereabouts unconfirmed, that's how we list people that we don't know where they are. But whereabouts unconfirmed really means we have confirmed they are not at the last place where they registered. Like we have a guy that's listed as whereabouts unconfirmed, and he's from Davenport, but we know he's in California. He has taunted us and said, guess what, I'm in California. And he is registered out there, but he's still on the Iowa website as whereabouts unconfirmed because he has never signed a registration to say that he's in California, and there's still an active warrant for his arrest. So should he ever decide to return here, which the possibility on this particular person is quite high, you know, then he will be arrested at that particular time. So we don't have, when they ask a question, how many people do you have that are non-compliant? Well, that's a pretty hard question to answer because are you talking about how many people have not updated their car? How many people have not updated who is living with them? We've had a question of how many people are in Iowa that are not registered. It's kind of like, how do we know people are speeding on I-80? It's like, we know, And we actually just uncovered somebody the other day here in the metro that has been here for 6 years and has avoided registration by living here under another name. That was a pretty fun case, actually. So they still film at 11 on that one. But he has to register here, and he hadn't done so. Any other questions? Failed to register or any of those? Modifications? I know I went through this rather quickly. A lot of times I get calls. This is an example of one of the email registration notifications. I have Urbandale because I live in Urbandale. I am not inundated with hundreds of emails. If you put in all of Polk County that has the highest number of registrants, you might get a lot of email. But it's better to do it by your residence and then a mile or 5 mile search. And then it's highlighted to tell you what the changes were. So you don't have to guess what was it before, what is it now. It's highlighted into what has changed now. What can we do? What can we do about sex offenders? What can we do? A lot of people say, oh, I don't want my address on there. And that is an important point. I'm glad I said that. We will not put your facility name on the website. It'll be like 123 Main Street or whatever P.O. box. Well, they can't register only a P.O. box, but 123 Main Street, whatever town, Iowa. We are not going to put Scenic Manor Nursing Home, 123 Main Street, okay? We don't put names of hospitals. We're not putting like Mercy Medical Center. We're not putting the name of like the VA hospital and things like that. We're just putting on the address. But we need to be aware. And this is, again, more speaking on the personal level than maybe on the professional level. Sometimes people call me and they want to know what that sex offender can and cannot do. Well, what's more important is for you to be aware. You know your neighbor is a sex offender. If you see children coming in and out of there every day, that might be a little suspicious. Now, do you have to know, can this guy be around children? You don't have to know that. Call the police and say, you know, my neighbor is a sex offender, and I'm seeing kids go in and out of there every day, and something just doesn't seem right. I don't know what his restrictions are, but I wanted to make you aware of this. Then an officer can go investigate. If there is no crime, there's no crime. But if something is going on, then they start their case. Because my role is more law enforcement than it is like to do risk assessment and treatment. Mine is enforcement to make sure that they're following the rules and regulations. So you want to report any specific activity. The whole idea is to protect yourself and your family. If you know the guy across the street is a sex offender, then you don't want to take your granddaughter trick-or-treating at their house. You don't have to know, are they allowed to answer the door on Halloween? Because that may be an item of probation, but it's not an item of registration. Is there any other questions? Yes.
If someone is in one of their treatment programs and they're a life person, does that mean they're also a life person on the registry?
Sort of. Okay. What they're referring to with the lifetime supervision is called special sentence, right? Okay, the Iowa Sex Offender Registry, you have to register for 10 years or life or the duration of your special sentence. Special sentence first came into law July of 2005. Since the minimum registration period is 10 years, the Sex Offender Registry is not going to be looking at that until 2015. If the law stays the same as it is today, then yes, the person will have to continue to register for the life. One other minor note too is a lot of people think Tier 3 means life. Tier 3 does not mean life. Tier 3 means you go in 4 times per year. So we do have people that are Tier 1 that have to register for life, as well as some of the others. Any other questions? Well, it's really been my pleasure to be here today, and I wish you the best with your conference.
Thank you very much.